This is The Quiet End, and tonight I'll tell you a story titled Spires of the Black Moon. Let's begin. The shuttle trembled as its landing gear settled into the ashen soil of the distant moon. Through the cabin's reinforced windows, the astronauts gazed out at a landscape unlike anything they'd encountered before. The surface was barren, a monochromatic expanse under a sky that seemed almost hungry in its depthless black. Jagged spires, taller than skyscrapers, rose in irregular patterns across the horizon. Their surfaces shimmered faintly, as though coated in liquid shadow. The light didn't come from above. The stars here were eerily dim, but instead radiated from the spires themselves, bathing the land in a sinister glow. Captain Alara Voss was the first to break the silence. Spectrograph readings show organic traces. Something's alive here. Her voice carried a tension that had built since their descent, though she tried to mask it behind professionalism. Beside her, Lieutenant Kieran Hale tightened his grip on his scanner. "Could be interference," he muttered, though his own unease betrayed him. The whispering sound had begun shortly after they touched down. A faint, unintelligible murmur carried on an unnatural wind. Dismissed initially as static, it now seemed closer, more deliberate. "Interference or not," Dr. Lin Tao interjected, peering at the spires with scientific curiosity, "we came here to investigate. Those structures, they're symmetrical, almost deliberate. We should get samples." The cabin door hissed open, and the team stepped onto the moon's surface. The ground was harder than expected, almost metallic underfoot, and the faint murmur grew clearer, though still unintelligible. As they approached the nearest spire, its sheer scale dwarfed them. Ilara reached out, her gloved hand brushing the surface, and for a brief moment the whispering ceased entirely. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Then the spire pulsed, a slow, deliberate thrum that seemed to reverberate in their bones. Kieran staggered back, dropping his equipment, his eyes wide. "It's alive," he stammered, but before anyone could respond, the whispering returned. Louder now, urgent and overlapping, as though thousands of voices were speaking at once. None could make out the words, yet the intent was unmistakable. They were intruders. "Pull back," Ilara ordered sharply. But as they turned to retreat, the glow from the spire deepened, casting long, unnatural shadows across the barren plains. The shuttle, once visible in the distance, was now obscured. "Where's the ship?" Lin's voice cracked with panic. The spires were moving. The team moved cautiously toward the nearest spire, its towering presence looming larger with every step. The shimmering surface seemed almost liquid, yet none of their instruments could determine its composition. Dr. Lin ran her scanner along its base, frowning as the device flickered and died. "It's rejecting our systems," she murmured, unnerved. "I can't get a reading." The whispers, once faint on the wind, now felt impossibly close, as if emanating from the spire itself. Words, soft and fragmented, teased the edges of their minds, forming phrases they couldn't quite comprehend. Kieran stopped abruptly and tilted his head, his expression blank. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice hollow. "It said my name." "Nobody's saying anything," Ilara snapped, her commanding tone faltering under the strain of mounting unease. "Focus. This thing, it's manipulating us. Eyes on the mission." But Kieran stepped closer, almost hypnotized. Against the captain's orders, he reached out and placed his hand on the spire's surface. The oily texture rippled beneath his glove, and his knees buckled as his breath caught sharply. "Vertigo," he gasped. It's pulling me in." He staggered back, clutching his helmet and trembling. Voices. Thousands of them. I saw faces familiar and wrong. They were calling my name. His voice dropped to a whisper. They knew me. The spire pulsed faintly, glowing with a rhythm almost like a heartbeat. The team collectively froze, watching as waves of dark, shimmering light rolled across its surface. Lin suddenly dropped her scanner, her hands trembling. "This isn't natural. It's alive," she whispered, echoing Kieran's earlier fear. "And it knows we're here." Ilara clenched her jaw, forcing herself to remain steady. "Fall back to the shuttle, now." But as the team turned, the whispers transformed into a guttural roar, reverberating through their suits. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and for a fleeting moment the spire's form warped, stretching impossibly tall before returning to its jagged shape. Something inside it stirred. The team set up a temporary camp near the spire, their focus fixed on unraveling the anomaly before them. Floodlights illuminated the immediate area, casting harsh shadows that danced unnervingly across the spire's shimmering surface. Inside the cramped confines of their portable shelter, recordings were reviewed on loop, but instead of clarity, they brought new discomfort. "Do you hear that?" Lynn asked, leaning closer to the playback. The whispers, once unintelligible, had begun to take form. Fragments of a language, alien and guttural, shifted through the static. Some words seemed to twist into sounds almost recognizable, as if mimicking human speech. "It's learning," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Kieran, sitting at the edge of the shelter, rubbed his temples furiously. "I don't need the recording," he said, his voice trembling. "I hear it now. Without the equipment, it's in the air." His eyes darted to the spire outside, its faint pulsing visible through the shelter's window. "It's louder when you look at it." As the hours dragged on, fatigue settled over the crew like a heavy fog. One by one, they drifted to uneasy sleep, except for Kieran, who sat stiffly as if afraid to close his eyes. But it wasn't long before murmurs broke the silence. Lynn stirred in her cot, muttering softly, her voice unnaturally steady despite her unconscious state. The same alien phrases echoed from her lips, repeated in perfect cadence. "Lynn," Elara called softly, but the scientist's eyes remained shut as her voice grew louder. "Karanazi, Voshnala, Karanazi," she said, the words twisting unnervingly. Then, without warning, she woke with a scream, bolting upright and clutching her head. "It's in my mind," she cried, her voice raw, her fingers clawing at her skull as if trying to rip something out. "It's speaking through me. It's inside." The shelter was in chaos, the whispers now audible to everyone. They weren't coming from the recordings anymore. They were coming from the spire. No, from everywhere, as if the moon itself had begun speaking. Lynn's screams turned to sobs as she rocked back and forth, her voice broken. I felt its presence," she whispered. "It's watching us." Outside, the spire pulsed again, sharper this time, as though responding to her words. The floodlights flickered violently, casting the camp into brief episodes of darkness. And in those moments, shadows moved where no shadows should exist. The isolation of the moon began to weigh on them. But it wasn't the silence that unnerved the crew, it was the whispers. What had once been faint murmurs now bore individual voices, accusatory and sharp, slipping beneath their thoughts like invasive threads. Kieran was the first to experience the hallucinations. As he looked toward the spire, his vision warped unnaturally. The barren landscape twisted into impossible shapes, mountains inverted, folding into the sky, rivers flowing with what looked like molten obsidian. When he blinked, the grotesque forms dissolved, but their after images lingered, burned into his mind. "It's showing me something," he muttered, his voice tinged with awe and fear. "A place I've never seen before." Lynn sat trembling in her corner, clutching her knees. Her eyes darted to her surroundings, following half-formed figures that seemed to shift in and out of reality. They were translucent, humanoid yet wrong, their limbs too many, their faces stretching and collapsing in impossible ways. "They're watching us," she whispered, her breath shaky. "And I think they're laughing." Elara tried to hold the team together, her voice firm as she barked orders, but even she couldn't escape the visions. Without warning, flashes of memories surfaced in her mind, places and events she didn't recognize. A child's laughter, a storm raging over an alien ocean, and distant cries of anguish that felt too close. "These aren't mine," she murmured, gripping the edge of the shelter's table so hard her knuckles turned white. "Where are these coming from?" The words from the whispers grew more personal, digging into each astronaut's vulnerabilities. "You failed them, Captain," a voice hissed in Elara's ear, soft but cutting. She spun around, but no one was there. Kieran's whispers were different, urging him forward, promising enlightenment. "They're guiding us," he insisted, his eyes wide and wild. "They're trying to show us the truth." "No," Lynn countered, her voice rising in panic. "They're manipulating us. They're inside our heads. Don't you see? They're twisting us." The tension fractured the group further. Kieran stood defiantly, his gaze fixed on the spire. "I'm going back," he announced. "I need to know what it wants. You can stay here and cower." "You're not thinking clearly," Elara snapped, grabbing his arm. but Kieran pushed her away. "You don't understand. None of you do," he shouted, storming out of the shelter toward the pulsing spire. The whispers grew louder in the distance, their rhythm almost melodic. Alara turned to Lynn, whose eyes were glazed with fear. "If we don't stop this, we're going to lose him, and ourselves," she said grimly. But even as she spoke, the whispers began to change, their tone conspiratorial, as though they were aware of her every thought. She shivered, realizing the moon wasn't just alive, it was listening. The harsh lights of the camp flickered erratically as the crew stumbled back into the open, their eyes drawn to the horizon. More spires had emerged, their jagged forms stretching upward like skeletal fingers clawing at the void. They hadn't seen them before, but now it was impossible to ignore. Each was larger than the last, their oily surfaces shimmering in waves of unsettling motion, as though feeding off the very fabric of the moon. The whispers evolved into an unrelenting cacophony, no longer soft or fragmented. They screamed now, urgent, anguished screams that seemed to demand obedience, submission, sacrifice. Lynn clutched her helmet, falling to her knees. "It's too loud," she cried, her voice cracking as she fought to breathe. "Make it stop!" But Kieran didn't resist. He stood motionless, staring at the largest spire, his expression blank but his posture resolute. "They're calling me," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, as if the screams had hollowed him out. He stepped forward, toward the shimmering colossus that loomed like a dark god against the horizon. "Kieran, stop!" Alara shouted, rushing after him, but it was too late. He walked faster, drawn by something invisible, something irresistible. As he approached the spire, its pulsing intensified, casting grotesque shadows across the barren land. The oily surface rippled at his touch, and before anyone could pull him back, he stepped inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the spire erupted in a burst of shadow, a violent, unnatural wave that slammed into the crew with enough force to knock them to the ground. When the darkness receded, Kieran was gone. Not a trace remained, not even his footprints. He's gone," Lynn whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes wide with horror. "It took him." The screams from the spires grew louder, overlapping into maddening layers of sound. The crew scrambled to their shuttle, desperate to escape, but as Alara activated the navigation systems, the display flickered and failed. Every compass, every coordinate was scrambled beyond recognition. "We're trapped," she realized, her voice shaking. "It's blocking us." Lynn clawed at her console, trying to make sense of the chaos. "The spires, they're everywhere now," she said, her voice rising in panic. "They're closing in." Indeed, the spires seemed closer than ever, though none of them had seen them move. Their pulsing light surged in unison, as if preparing for something. Between the shadows and the screams, the moon itself felt alive, predatory. "We're not supposed to leave," Alara muttered, gripping the armrest of her seat. "It wants us here. It wants us to serve." Outside, the largest spire pulsed again, a slow, deliberate rhythm like the beating heart of something ancient and wrathful. The whispers returned, softer now, but unmistakable in their command: surrender. The crew huddled in the dim light of the shelter, their voices barely audible over the unrelenting hum of the spires. Fragmented transmissions crackled from the shuttle's failing systems, static interspersed with garbled words, as though the moon itself was speaking to them through the chaos. "Listen," Lynn said, her voice sharp with desperation as she adjusted the frequencies. Beneath the static, a pattern emerged, tones and rhythms layered with distorted alien speech. The whispers now carried meaning, their fragmented phrases aligning with the broken transmissions. "They're sentient," Lynn whispered, her eyes wide with a mix of horror and awe. "The spires, they're alive. They're not just structures, they're remnants of something ancient." Alara leaned closer, her face pale, her breath shallow. "Remnants of what?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. The whispers grew sharper, clearer, as though answering her directly. Images flooded their minds, towering civilizations, beings of impossible complexity, their forms shimmering like the oily texture of the spires. But the images quickly turned dark. The beings became twisted, consumed by their creations, their essence devoured by the very structures they had built. "They feed on consciousness," Lynn said, clutching her head as the knowledge forced its way into her thoughts. "Every mind they take, every thought, it makes them stronger." She looked toward Alara, trembling. The moon, it's a prison. These spires, they were locked away, but we woke them. We're their food now. Alara's stomach turned as the realization sank in. Their arrival had been the trigger, the key that had undone millennia of containment. The spires pulsed in unison, their hunger palpable, their whispers louder than ever. It wasn't just Kieran, she murmured, her voice hollow. They're taking all of us, slowly. Lynn turned back to the transmissions, frantic. We have to warn Earth, she said, her hands shaking as she tried to stabilize the signal. If they send another team, if anyone else comes here, they'll spread. But the spire's whispers seemed to mock her efforts, drowning out her thoughts with their insidious rhythm. Outside, the largest spire pulsed again, and for a moment the flashes of alien landscapes returned. But this time, there was something new, something worse. A mass of writhing darkness, alive and consuming, spreading outward like a plague. The moon wasn't just a prison, it was a seed, and now it was beginning to grow. We have to stop this, Alara said, her voice trembling but resolute, before it's too late. But even as she said it, she knew the spires were listening, and they would not let their prey escape. The whispers had transformed into deafening chants, a relentless tide of sound that pressed against the astronauts' minds like a vice. Alara struggled to stay upright, her knees buckling under the weight of the noise, but it was more than sound. It was something alive, clawing at her thoughts, reshaping her perception of reality itself. Lynn collapsed beside her, clutching at nothing, her fingers digging into the barren ground as though trying to anchor herself. I can't fight it, she gasped, her voice choking between desperate breaths. It's pulling me. Her words cut off as her body stiffened, her eyes wide and unseeing. Slowly she rose, her movements unnatural, her limbs jerking as if controlled by invisible strings. Lynn! Alara shouted, reaching out, but Lynn was already moving toward the nearest spire, her steps dragging, her body trembling as though resisting something far more powerful than her will. The oily surface shimmered violently, ripples spreading outward as if anticipating her arrival. When Lynn touched the spire, her body convulsed, bending in impossible ways. Her screams echoed across the moon but were quickly swallowed by the chants, her voice dissolving into the cacophony. Her form was absorbed into the spire's surface, stretching and twisting until nothing remained but a faint, shimmering stain. The spire pulsed, taller now, its jagged edges reaching further into the void. Alara staggered back, her chest tight with panic, but her own limbs betrayed her. She felt the pull, a magnetic force from the spires invading her muscles, dragging her forward against her will. The air around her warped, bending light and sound until the horizon rippled like water. The spires cast shifting shadows that seemed alive, wrapping around her as she tried to resist. No, she screamed, her voice cracking as her boots scraped against the metallic ground. But the chants grew louder, their rhythm insidious, their meaning undeniable. Surrender. The spires fed on her fear, their oily surfaces moving like liquid, hungry and waiting. Reality fragmented around her. Images of grotesque landscapes and writhing figures spilled into her mind, drowning her in visions of ruin. One by one, the remaining crew were drawn toward the spires. Some fought, screaming, their movements frantic and desperate. Others walked willingly, their faces void of expression, their bodies already claimed. Each touch of the spires brought new pulses of shadow, sent rippling into the sky like a signal of awakening. The spires grew taller, their jagged forms impossible to measure now, their bases sinking deeper into the moon's surface as their power spread. The chants weren't confined to the moon anymore. They stretched outward, an insidious poison spilling into the void, a call to everything that could hear. And as the last scream faded, the spires stood silent, waiting. The moon lay still, its surface bereft of movement, yet heavy with a presence that defied explanation. The spires now towered higher than thought should allow, their jagged forms blotting out the faint light of distant stars. The oily texture that had once shimmered with faint pulses now gleamed like void black mirrors, reflecting nothing but silence. The astronauts were gone. Every trace of their presence had been erased. No footprints, no discarded tools, not even the shelter or shuttle remained. It was as though the moon had devoured them whole, consuming every fragment of their existence. The whispers, once maddeningly incessant, had ceased entirely, but the void left behind carried a dreadful, suffocating weight. Above, the sky stretched empty and hungry, a perpetual night that mirrored the moon's desolation. The spires stood eternal now, monoliths of despair, silent witnesses to the horrors they had unleashed. Their oily surfaces rippled faintly, as though the consciousness they had consumed still stirred within, trapped, unable to escape. The black moon loomed, waiting for the next visitors to awaken its hunger, for the next minds to feed the insatiable void. It did not rush, it had no need to. The spires had eternity, and eternity was patient. Somewhere in the vastness of space, ships drifted, piloted by explorers who had yet to hear the whispers, yet to know the truth, yet to understand the cost of curiosity. The spires stood silent and watching, waiting. So tell me, dear listener, if you heard whispers from the dark depths of eternity, would you answer their call? Subscribe for more chilling tales, and hit the bell to stay in the dark. See you at the next quiet end.